Right. So welcome to Democracy Loves Strong and Stable Government. This is a webinar by Make Votes Matter, which is the national campaign for proportional representation in the UK. And we collaborate closely with Fair Vote Canada and many organisations in the UK to bring about electoral reform, because we need it not just in the UK, but in many other countries as well. We could quite safely say that first past the post is one of the UK's worst colonial exports ever. So thank you all for being here. And just to say very briefly what Make Votes Matter is, we are a fully cross-party campaign for proportional representation, which simply means that seats should match votes in Parliament. We have an alliance of many parties, all the British opposition parties, aside from Labour, many Labour MPs and other politicians, and excitingly, and particularly on this call, Conservative MPs and politicians as well. We also have a very active grassroots all over the country. This was evidenced, I think, in one of the most colourful, exciting ways on Saturday just gone. We had our big summer action day, which was called Get Moving for PR. And we had people all over the country doing walks and doing the conga and dressing up as suffragettes and doing all sorts of things to draw people's attention to the fact that we don't yet have real democracy. We're kind of on the way there, but we're not there yet. So we're continuing the campaigns of suffragists for many centuries, including the suffragettes. And we really just want all votes to count equally so that we can have a fair democracy in which all voices are heard. So we're here because first past the post isn't working. Despite what Theresa May said when she said that there was strong and stable government with first past the post, it definitely factually doesn't result in strong and stable government. This has been evidenced not just in the UK, but as many of you know, in other countries like Canada, the USA, India, and Belarus. So Belarus is the only other country in Europe that uses first past the post, and it is in fact a dictatorship. So not a good voting system, frankly. It distorts outcomes, including the extreme wrong winner elections. So, for example, in the UK, there was one time when the Conservatives had the most votes and Labour won power, and another time when it was the other way around. And we know that Trump won power in the United States when actually he got fewer votes than his opponent. So clearly, if a voting system is resulting in election outcomes where people get the opposite of what they were choosing, I don't believe that can be true to what the root of the word democracy is, demos and kratos from Greek, which means people, power. So the people really aren't in power if they're getting opposite to what they wanted. Just a couple very brief stats about the UK. 71% of votes were wasted at the last election. And what we normally have is governments that don't represent the majority. The last time that the majority, a government had majority support from voters was 1935. And what we end up seeing is Punch and Judy politics. So it's two groups of people shouting at each other a lot of the time. That's not the full picture, but that is a significant part of it. And we get really seesaw politics. So two opposition parties will, when they come to power, undo the work of the previous party. And that's not good for the people, it's not good for the economy, it's not good for the environment, it's not good for society. So I'm now going to pass to our speakers, with no further ado. And first of all, I would like to introduce Stephen Kinnock, who is on a different place on the document, is the Member of Parliament for Aberavon in South Wales, a long-time supporter of Make Votes Matter. He also serves as Shadow Minister for Immigration and formerly Shadow Minister for the Armed Forces, and before that, Asia and Pacific. He chairs multiple all-party parliamentary groups on steel, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and electoral campaigning transparency. Alongside this, he is chair of Renaissance, a voter engagement initiative to connect the Labour Party with its former voters. Welcome, Stephen. Please give us your view on first past the post and strong and stable government.
Well, thank you so much, Klein. And it's, as always, a real pleasure to be at a Make Votes Matter event. And thank you so much again for the invitation. I should start with an apology. I'm unfortunately not going to be able to stay for the Q&A because I have to be at a meeting at 7 o'clock our time with Mark Drakeford, our First Minister for Wales, who's in Westminster today. So I'm apologising in advance. I can't stay for the Q&A, which is usually by far the most interesting bit of these sessions. But hopefully I can say a few words which will help to frame the debate, and we've got an absolutely brilliant panel to take this debate further. I thought I should start really by just underlining some very basic principles of democracy. Number one, that every vote must carry equal weight. And number two, that the number of seats are allocated to a political party in Parliament must be a direct reflection of the number of votes cast for that party at the ballot box. This is not rocket science. These are the basic fundamental principles of a functioning democracy. And I think that relates to the theme of today, because my view is that the strength and stability of your democratic system flows from its legitimacy. And if you have a system that doesn't allow every vote to carry equal weight and doesn't reflect where the number of seats, where the link between the number of seats in Parliament and the number of votes secured at the ballot box, if that link is broken, well, the legitimacy of your system is fundamentally undermined. And that, I think, leads to a weak and unstable system as opposed to a strong and stable system. We've got 650 MPs in the House of Commons, but the reality is we know that general elections are won or lost in the 100 marginal seats. So if you happen to live in one of those 100 marginal seats, your vote carries hugely more weight than it does in the other 550. And we simply can't support a system where only 100 constituencies really count. That is an affront to democracy, and I think an insult to millions of people who the system treats as second-class citizens because they're in so-called safe seats. Looking at that second basic principle of seats reflecting votes, in December 2019, the Conservatives won 44% of the popular vote, but they now have 56% of the seats in Parliament. 2017, Labour won 40% of the popular vote, but we ended up with just 36% of seats in Parliament. And in 2015, the SNP won 50% of the popular vote in Scotland, but 95% of the Scottish seats in Parliament. I think you get the picture. There's so many examples of these quirks in the system and what they deliver. Measured against that benchmark, first past the post is simply not fit for purpose, because the link between votes cast and seats allocated is utterly broken. And then I think it breeds this winner-takes-all culture that has done huge damage to the communities that our democracy is supposed to serve. It delivers greater income inequality, less corporate control, better long-term planning, and so political stability is almost always prevalent in more proportional systems. And more proportional systems have fairer representation of women and minorities, higher voter turnout, and better environmental laws. So decades of research show that countries that use a proportional system actually deliver far better outcomes for their citizens. Tactical voting is also a really damaging outcome. Polling found that in the 2017 general election, 20 to 30% of those who voted tactically, i.e. they held their noses and voted for a party they don't really support in order to keep the party they really hate out. And that's just not a positive way to run our democracy. So almost 7 million people in 2017 had to hold their noses while voting. You know, what does that say about our democracy, really? Millions of people going to the ballot box to vote for the least worst option rather than the option that they actually support. Research has also shown that, I mean, this is not, I'm genuinely not trying to make a party political point here. It's simply a matter of fact that there has been an inherent bias to the Conservative Party. I think this is an amazing statistic. Since 1945, the Conservatives have won 41% of the popular vote. When you aggregate the popular vote over every general election since 1945, Labour has won 40%, so very, very close, but the Conservatives have been in government for 63% of the time. And I think that that stokes a sense as well of disillusion and disconnect. The voting system fuels frustration, disenfranchisement, people feeling their voice can't be heard, and that gives them, that makes other modes of attraction, expression attractive to them, I should say. They slip into extremism. I actually think some people say more proportional systems fuel extremist parties, but actually when you look at the way the system works in our country, you often get an internal takeover of the large parties by one or other of its more extreme wings. And it's with that point I wanted to conclude really by saying there's certainly no evidence that first past the post has delivered more strong and stable government over the last 6 or 7 years in British politics. And what you see at the moment, I think, is a faction of the Conservative Party, the European Research Group, with a huge amount of power because the current Prime Minister is relying on their support to keep himself in place. And there's such a lack of transparency in that because people vote for a particular party at a general election, but what you find is there are parties within parties, factions within factions who end up taking over, and that leads to a real disconnect in terms of what people have voted for. And of course, let's not forget, you also ended up with a hung parliament in 2017, and the Conservative Prime Minister at the time had to basically buy the votes of the Democratic Unionist Party by giving them £1 billion, and we then went into a period of real parliamentary chaos. So there's no evidence to suggest that it delivers strong and stable government. We need a basic democratic principle where every vote carries equal weight and the number of seats allocated to a party reflect the number of votes given to that party at the ballot box. And with those basic principles in place, I think we can get a far more legitimate system, and from legitimacy we get strength, stability, and a much better constructive political culture will actually deliver long-term benefits to the people of this country. Thank you very much, Kleiner.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Really fantastic to hear your view there. I'm now going to introduce Terry Reinke. She's Vice President of the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament. She is co-president of the LGBTI Intergroup, a member of the EU-UK Parliamentary Assembly. She is a member of the European Parliament since 2014, working for civil liberties, social justice, women's rights, and many more things. So welcome very much, Terry. Would you like to share with us your views on first past the post and strong and stable government?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I have to greet you from the beautiful city of Düsseldorf, where I'm actually currently negotiating a hopefully strong and stable government because we just had elections here. And you know what is very ironic about the situation, that North Rhine-Westphalia, my home state, actually is a state that was co-founded or founded by the Brits. It was the British sector here, and actually they introduced a personalized proportional voting system. So it's very funny that we have that already, and I think in the UK you're still working to get there. So yes, I wanted to make 3 main points why I believe that proportional voting systems are more democratic, and why I believe that they also deliver on strong and stable governments. And then I'm mostly going to elaborate on the last point because I thought that that's probably most interesting for you. I'm sure that the other speakers are also going to give a lot of insight. And the first one is exactly about the point that was just mentioned, that proportional voting systems are generally more inclusive voting systems, less of the votes are lost. And I also believe that this is important, that people actually feel that they have a voice in democracy, that they can choose on the basis of a program of a party, on different personalities inside of a party, who they want to support in an election, that there is a real competition between different parties, and that this also then creates a better representation inside of parliament of the society. And let me say this, we are all living in societies that are becoming more diverse, and exactly in situations like this, it is so important that this diversity is then also carried to parliaments, which are the places where a lot of the political debate inside of our societies are happening. The second point I wanted to make, and this was already touched upon before as well, it's about the counter arguments, because very often the counter arguments say that you know, when you have proportional voting systems, there are unstable governments, there are too many parties represented in parliament, and this basically creates an unstable environment. And I think that this is wrong in two ways, because first of all, the stability in a democratic system for me is not only represented by the fact of how many governments you have had, because also big political ideas can be shaped through different governments, because, you know, in a proportional voting system, you very often don't have these strong cuts between other governments taking over. So I think that this is something that really matters to me. And secondly, I mean, if you look at the history of, for example, Germany, it's probably the case that I know the best. It's not true. It's not factually true that, you know, a country that has proportional voting system has less stable governments. I mean, I think we have had 9 chancellors since the Second World War in Western Germany, and then in the reunited Germany. So you could see that actually proportional voting system, the personalized proportional voting system in Germany can provide this. And plus, and this is maybe a little bit of a European reflection as well. I mean, in the European Parliament, we are working without even having a stable governmental majority, and we still come up with proposals in terms of directives, in terms of regulations and laws. And I think that it's a reason where you can also see that you can build strong majorities also when you don't have you know, just one party taking power. And the third point, and I think that's for me actually the most important point that I wanted to speak about, it's about how it shapes political culture, because I think it doesn't only have an effect on people being represented and you have stable governments, but also you have a more inclusive and I think also more topic-oriented political debate. And this is something that I think, especially in times when we have a very heavy polarization, when we have, you know, racist, far-right tendencies in societies growing. You can look at the US. I think you can also look at the UK, at Germany, other places that you can see these tendencies. It is absolutely important that in politics, we also create a democratic space where compromise can be found. And I believe in a proportional voting system that is more likely. Just to give you one example, when we go into election campaigning, you know, everybody's fighting against each other, obviously, because you want to get a lot of votes. But at the end of the day, we also know that we might have to work together afterwards. So this, I think, makes the debate a little bit more maybe civilized. I don't know if that's the good English word to use. And I believe that this is important. But not only that, also for the way that this then reflects on broader societal debates. I believe it makes them more program and topic oriented. And it very often includes civil society organizations in a better way, because you are trying to get the input in these debates. So I think that in a lot of ways, proportional representation is more democratic, includes more people, makes more voices heard, and can also create strong and stable governments, and can really deliver for the people, for the citizens, because at the end of the day, this is what we want. This is why we do, you know, all the debates in Parliament, that we make the lives of people better. And I think that this is really something that a proportional representation is very useful for. And I have to apologize. I'm so sorry, but I will also have to leave a little bit earlier. But now I'm looking forward to the other interventions and your questions, obviously. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Terry. That's great to hear from a democracy which already has PR and doesn't have complete chaos. And in fact, when people say PR results in chaos, I think that what we can say to counteract that is actually it normally results in cooperation, collaboration, and consensus. So it's 3 different C's that we're talking about. So if everybody could please post any questions that they've got as they think of them in the chat, that would be great. And the team will be putting those onto a document so that we can get them all asked at the end, or as many of them as we can. And I am now delighted to introduce Malcolm Baumann. Malcolm I've been quoting for years because he shared a concern with us about having PR for the House of Lords because of the Australian experience, and maybe I'll allow Malcolm to talk about that rather than me, but frankly I think having PR for the Lords is a diversion. It's a way of avoiding getting it for the House of Commons, which is the primary legislative chamber. So Malcolm, he's worked for several years as an independent politician's political advisor and minister's chief of staff in one of Australia's PR elected state level assemblies. He has also worked in public service and national NGO roles and writes online on electoral science and outcomes. Over to you, Malcolm.
Hello, everybody, and good evening. I'm calling in from the Wiradjuri country in south central New South Wales. Hello, everybody. Look, I've got to race through a few things to try and bring the history of Australia and its preferential voting and its use of STV into this story. But firstly, I want to say the theme of this discussion is concerned with strong or stable government. And I want to remind us all a bit of a be careful what you wish for warning. Strong and stable sound like positive words. But if strong means an extremely dominant Prime Minister's office lording it over Parliament, is that what you want? If stable means that government rattles along being unaccountable on a day by day or year by year basis, is that a stability you want? I think what those terms are really connoting is secure government. And I would observe that the original conception of representative and responsible parliamentary government was not meant to guarantee secure government. If you want secure government, have a presidential system. The parliamentary history of Britain and of my country was meant to be concerned with Parliament keeping an executive to account in a regular and ongoing basis. And in doing so, doing some of the things that Terry spoke about as being successful in Germany, of changing the political culture on a continuing and ongoing basis so that it is one that is responsible to a representative Parliament. So the two elements there are Parliament, the executive should not be secure from Parliament's oversight, but also that the parliamentary chamber in question should be representative. First past the post destroys both those terms. It makes governments artificially secure when they shouldn't be, and it creates parliaments that aren't representative, and therefore they're not the right kind of parliament to attempt to do that process. Now, I want to race through the history of Australian electoral systems to get you up to speed with where we are at the moment. We were active very early, and by that I mean the 1860s onwards, we were debating preferable ways to elect parliaments. Preferable, I mean, to first past the post as it came to be known in the 1880s. In the late 1890s, we actually introduced the first model of STV voting in the world in the state of Tasmania. It has endured to this day. There is no reason for suggesting that government in Tasmania has been in any way unstable for doing so. We adopted preferential voting in 1918. It was, of course, a central element of STV from its initial design back in the 1850s, been widely discussed in the latter part of the century as Australia federated and as we discussed our parliamentary constitutions. It was almost adopted for the National House of Representatives in 1902, but the bill collapsed, long story I won't bore you with. And finally, it was adopted in 1918 when the Conservative side of politics was splitting into two parts, in effect, one part urban, one part rural. They didn't want to keep losing elections to the Labor Party, so they brought in preferential voting so that the two wings, if you like, of Conservative politics would not undermine each other. They later mutated into a very settled coalition, but for just over 101 years, Australia has had preferential voting in our Houses of Parliament. Racing forward, in 1948, we adopted STV for the election of our Senate, which represents the states equally. It's a very malapportioned house. Each state gets 12 senators regardless of population, which is a little bit not good, but there it is, can't be changed. And then from the 1970s onwards, the upper houses of most of our state parliaments, we have 6 state parliaments and 2 substantially sized territories, most of our state parliaments adopted STV for the election of their upper houses known as legislative councils. I'm going to quickly put a chart on screen for a minute or two. Bear with me while I do that. I'm assuming you guys can see that chart there. Now, if you look across the block across the top, the Commonwealth government, 4 of the largest states, Alex, please speak up if you can't see that chart, have what I might call the standard model. The lower house is elected by what you in Britain would call AV. The upper houses are elected by what we would all call STV. 2 of the jurisdictions have the opposite, a lower house elected by STV, and in Tasmania's case, an upper house elected by AV, and in the case of the ACT, there isn't one. So what you're looking at on screen is the diversity of the 9 parliamentary systems in Australia. That standard model means that preferential voting in single member divisions is the predominant way of electing parliaments in this country. It's not radically different from first past the post in its impact on party formulation and culture. Single member divisions is the key issue. You can have preferential voting, but whether you have it in single member divisions or multi-member divisions makes the enormous difference. STV is a system of proportional representation. In fact, it was the first system to use that name back in the 19th century. Single member division by preferential voting causes party formation that's broadly similar to what you're experiencing with first past the post. The difference is preferential voting creates a higher sense of public legitimacy. Australians love their preferencing. You'll hear us ramble on about preferences, first preferences, later preferences, preference flows, the result after the final distribution of preferences and all of that. And this gives, I think, voters a sense of control that is not of the same kind at all as genuine PR elections. But it gives us a sense of control, which explains why there's very little movement in my country for any further reform. If you ask people about proportional representation in Australia, most people will nod and go, oh yes, but that's how the upper houses get elected and that's good enough for them. To come back to Kleiner's comment, I know that there is some kind of idea in Britain that if only the House of Lords were elected by a proportional method, that would be good enough and the House of Commons could rattle along with first past the post. I think that's a monumental attempt to distract people from the real importance of the debate. If your actual government is not being elected by being overseen by a representative house, then you're not getting the changes in political culture and you're not getting the changes in policy outcomes that you really want to see. So that's the situation. I'll just close that screen off now. That's the situation in Australia. As to stability of government, look, the real causes of instability in our governments are people aspiring to the leadership, let's be blunt. And very occasionally it might be a policy dispute, of which the big one in Australia in the last 15 years has been climate change and energy policy. Our country has hopelessly failed to come to terms with climate change policy. And those issues have caused instability. The 2 houses that are elected by proportional representation in Tasmania and in the ACT, where I used to work years ago, are by no means unstable. And indeed, the ACT government has had a coalition between Labor and the Greens party that is now approaching 22 years in age and has not produced any form of instability detectable to anybody. They've had neat transitions from one premier to the next and so forth. The real causes of disharmony lie elsewhere. They're not proportional representation. And as Terry reminded us, it would be absurd to say that Germany has a system that is not stable. It would be absurd to say that there's any lack of strength in its national or state governments administering public affairs. One final thing I want to say is that something else has emerged in Australia, which is intriguing. It began in about 1990, and that's the election of larger and larger crossbenches of independent politicians. I happened to work for one back in the 90s when it was a peculiarity. Nobody really thought very deeply about it. My boss became the first independent minister since Federation. It was very exciting. People wrung their hands in the media and said it was the end of Westminster government as we knew it, and it wasn't. That was a bit of a one-off event, but starting about 10 years ago, independence had an increasing growth in all state parliaments. I have a website where I post blogs on various issues on this topic, and I've put it in the chat, and I've written about the Australian election a few weeks ago if you want more information. But 3 weeks ago, we had what is probably the most dramatic election in Australian history. We've elected a crossbench of over a dozen independents in a House of 151. It doesn't have the balance of power. The Labor government that just formed has a majority of 2 seats, but it is an extraordinary outcome. It's not a proxy for a proper PR style form of having a representative House, but it is going to dominate discussion in the next few years. And I think what can be said about it is that Australians, like people everywhere, are looking for alternatives. The vote for our 2 major parties is easily at the lowest level it's ever been. People are looking for other ways to influence the political culture. Fury at the inability to handle climate change was certainly a part of our recent election, and the outcome reflects that. We are also a country that is unsatisfied in a sense with the way our governments are rattling on, but we're not yet so unsatisfied that we tear down the system or we have a vibrant movement for electoral reform. And finally, Australians are also complacent in a sense because of one feature that is largely unique to us, which is very high rates of registration and compulsory voting. And I think those things are very beneficial, but I also think that they increase the sense of legitimacy people have in our parliaments, because we all have a culture in which we think virtually every single one of us has voted. We believe we've got 97% rate of registration and roughly 90% turnouts of that at elections. So we're complacent here in Australia. We don't feel the need to change in the same way that British and Canadian audiences do. If you do change in any way, you should not choose the Australian model of preferential voting in single member electorates. It's not a solution. I know that there are voices in Canada and the United States calling for ranked choice voting, but the correct solution is to do ranked choice voting in multi-member districts. That's STV, as the British invented 150 years ago. That will give you a better political culture. The Australian model will not. It will not radically change what you've got. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. So after hearing from a country where PR is working, a country where other systems are not so great, but maybe in some ways a little bit better. Thank you very much for sharing that. I would like to introduce Georgina de la Fuente. I'm sure I'm saying your first name wrong, so apologies. Georgina is a democratic governance professional with over 10 years of experience in electoral systems and management. She's currently doing research on political participation of women and violence against women in politics at the Observatory of Political Reforms in Latin America. For the past 6 years, she served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor in Mexico's electoral management body, the Instituto Nacional Electoral, if I'm saying that right. So welcome, Georgina, and maybe you could say how to pronounce your first name. Apologies.
Georgina is just fine. It's just perfect. And if you can just bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. I've prepared a very brief presentation for you all. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you to the entire Make Votes Matter team for putting together this event. And I'm going to talk to you very briefly about Mexico's experience with proportional representation, which has ensured political pluralism for the past 45 years since it was first installed. And you know, the objectives of this system, as have been set out in a decision by our Supreme Court back in 1998 while settling a case about PR at the local level, are right over here. You can see them, is obviously to ensure the participation of all political parties in the integration of the legislative branch, to ensure the representation of each in direct proportion to the percentage of votes received, to avoid the overrepresentation of dominant political parties, to effectively guarantee minorities' rights to participate, and to avoid the extreme effects of the popular will produced by a system of simple majority or first past the post. Now, this has certainly brought about a more democratic representation in our National Congress and a better balance to our presidential system. We also have a multi-party system, but it wasn't always like that. As you probably know, throughout most of the 20th century, Mexico had a single party rule. And it wasn't until our constitutional reform in 1977 that other parties were formally acknowledged, installing our current mixed system of representation. Now, our transition into democracy is mostly recognized after the year 2000, when we first elected a president from a different party. But actually, it was the political reform of 1977 that set this foundation for our transition. Now, what was happening in Mexico at the time? Well, we experienced the development of different political movements that operated sort of on the fringe of the system. They weren't formally recognized, so they mostly operated underground. We also saw the development of new labor unions that weren't controlled by the government, and these had particular political weight. I'm talking about important sectors like the energy sector, education, particularly university professors, and other sectors that actually represented political pressure for the government. We also faced a serious economic crisis. So then President López Portillo became well aware of this situation and realized that unless the system would formally recognize all these different political movements and forces, it would soon become impossible to maintain stability and actually govern. So in other words, what he intended was to keep the political system operating and prevent it from sort of overflowing in a way that articulating popular demands and trying to solve the big national problems would seem too difficult and almost impossible. So in this sense, our Constitution not only formalized the recognition for other political parties, but it also labeled them as entities of public interest. Now, this particular point is very important because it also meant that the state had the obligation to sort of ensure proper conditions for their operation, which translates obviously into public funding, but also it meant that they had the right to become part of the national representation of citizens in the branches of government, particularly the legislative branch, which is the formal representation of the Mexican people. So it established 300 seats to be elected through the first past the post system, we have 300 districts, and then another 100 seats to be distributed through proportional representation. Now, this number later increased into 200 in another reform in 1986, which brings us to a total of 500 members in our lower house of Congress, which is our current integration. So political parties are required to present closed lists of candidates in the order in which they will be formally considered to participate in the distribution of PR seats. It was agreed at the time that the system would effectively guarantee a number of seats to each political party that directly corresponds to or with the percentage of the votes received. But most importantly, it was recognized that the composition of the legislative would reflect more accurately the actual composition of the social and political forces in the country. Now, I must also say that this figure has gotten sort of a bad reputation over time. And one of the main criticisms of this is that, well, first past the post seats are actually representing the people, whilst PR seats mostly represent political parties. And, it is very common that political parties are not very popular figures, but we must also recognize that this bad reputation also comes from political parties placing questionable political figures in their lists that would otherwise never get elected. I'm speaking in the case of Mexico about corrupt politicians, their family members even, or in some cases, soap opera stars, those sort of figures that leads to thinking that parties use lists sort of as a way to pay for political favors. And that is a reality here in Mexico, and that is the reason why it has a bad reputation. However, I do believe that even though these arguments are valid, they're not enough to discredit the system, and it still remains the best way to correct the distortions in representation generated by simple majority voting and to ensure a proper representation of all the participants in elections. These concerns can be easily addressed through open or semi-open candidate lists as opposed to closed candidate lists. In the case of Mexico, as is the case of most other Latin American countries, political parties submit their candidate lists and voters have no say in the order or the integration of the lists. In other words, when you vote for a district representative, you are effectively endorsing that party's entire list of PR candidates as it is. Now, I would like to show you very quickly what, how the PR system has worked in Mexico and what it looks like, or what it has looked like over the years. So this was the result of the 1979 election, which was the first election after this reform was approved. And you can see, for instance, out of the 300 majority districts, the dominant party at the time obtained 296. And so the other smaller parties got a small, percentage of representation in our Congress. This was the election right after that. There are some limits that can be placed. For instance, at the time when a party got over 90 districts, so they weren't allowed to participate in the distribution of PR seats, because that meant that you're not a minority and that you have enough representation in our Congress. But let's go to more recent elections. We have other limits in place now. For instance, if you don't get at least 3% of the vote, you are not allowed to participate in the distribution of PR seats. This was our 2018 election. As you can see, it's a much more diverse, representation has changed over time, and we no longer live in a single party rule. And this was our latest election, which is our 2021 election. You can see the last three parties over there in black. Well, they didn't get at least 3% of the vote, so they effectively disappeared. They didn't even win a single district. So that's basically how it has worked over the years. Now, just to finish, I would like to talk about recent reforms to our PR system. For instance, our 2014 reform established a gender parity mandate. In the particular case of PR lists or candidate lists, political parties are now required to submit lists made up of 50% male, 50% female candidates, alternating male and female candidates all the way to the bottom of the list. Well, this was the direct result because when we first had our quota system, we first had at least 30% female, and then we went to 40% before having a gender parity mandate. What happened was that political parties would actually place female candidates way at the bottom of the list, and this would effectively prevent them from actually getting elected. And then our 2020 reform, which was also in a way that favors women candidates, is that, for example, you have to top your lists with different candidates of a different gender in every electoral process. So for instance, if you topped your list with a male candidate in the 2021 election, for 2024, the top of the list has to be a female candidate. And last but not least, as of 2021, these are administrative measures. These aren't actually in our electoral laws or constitutions, but we've had certain affirmative actions in favor of these different groups: indigenous groups, Afro-Mexicans. We have a very significant population of persons of African descent here in Mexico, persons with disabilities, migrants, and people from the LGBTIQ+ community, and that effectively, guarantees the election and the integration of a more diverse legislative branch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgina. That's really interesting. And I just want to flag about the lists and the complaints that PR is undemocratic because it uses party lists. So as you referenced, there are lists and then there are lists. Over here in the UK, in our Good Systems Agreement, which was launched in 2019, it specifies the principles of good voting systems and the best way to get there for the UK. And one of those principles is that any lists used in the voting system should be democratically determined, not just party lists. But it is also worth noting that under first past the post, actually they're party lists of one, which is even less democratic than a whole list of people. And I think that fact sometimes gets missed. So thank you very much. Really interesting to hear about Mexico. And I would now like to introduce David Gork, who I'm very excited to have here. David Gork, I need to get my notes back next to me. David Gork was Conservative MP for South West Hertfordshire from 2005 until 2019. He served as a Treasury Minister from 2010 before becoming Secretary of State for Work and Pensions in June 2017, and Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor in January 2018. He resigned from government in July 2019 and lost the Conservative whip and fought the 2019 general election, finishing second with nearly 16,000 votes. He is now head of public policy at the law firm McFarlane's and writes regularly for the New Statesman and Conservative Home. And I have to say, personally, losing the whip sounds like a good thing to me. Whips don't sound very nice. Be interesting to hear your view on that and about strong and stable government under first past the post. David.
Thank you, Kleiner. It wasn't my intention to lose the whip, but these things happen. And it certainly did give me much more freedom in my last few months in Parliament. It's very good to be with you this evening. And I speak as someone who was, I have to say, a long-standing supporter of first past the post. Now, I should caveat that by saying that this has always been an issue where I could see the other point of view. because I don't think there is ever a completely perfect system. And I think there are legitimate arguments to be made about first past the post in terms of constituency links. And I was largely sort of persuaded for a long time by the arguments of, well, you do have a clear result and it does allow a government to govern, and you can get rid of a government fairly emphatically, as happens from time to time. But I was also, even as a supporter of first past the post, I could recognize the points of unfairness, that where a result was wholly disproportionate or didn't reflect the proportions of the votes previously cast. And thinking about this further, I sort of came to the view that where perhaps first past the post is most defensible is in a system, in a simple two-party system, where essentially the public have a choice of two parties which by necessity become broad coalitions, and you hammer out a result accordingly. And in those circumstances, yes, there are imperfections, but broadly you could say that it would work. That's an argument I don't expect to persuade many people on this call, but let me put that argument forward. The difficulty is that, of course, we don't live in a world where two parties, even two broad coalitions, really work for the electorate. And increasingly, I think, and I'm going to be somewhat focused on the UK here, but I think these remarks may apply elsewhere, is that increasingly this leaves many voters dissatisfied and sometimes even disenfranchised. And I want to make the sort of particular argument, and I fully acknowledge the arguments we've heard over the course of this evening, but I want to make the particular argument about what is happening now with our politics, and why first past the post is failing us, why it results in bad government, and is likely to continue to result in bad government, and should be changed. And my principal argument here is that, look, British politics, as with much of the rest of the world, is realigning. It's realigning, moving away from politics that was largely based on, if you like, economic class, which and I simplify, but in very broad terms, those who are more economically secure tended to vote for centre-right parties, and those who are less economically secure tended to vote for centre-left parties. And that is how politics has generally operated in Western democracies. But what we see in the UK, and I think we're seeing something similar in most other places as well, is that politics is becoming more complicated, and that increasingly the divide is not so much on economic security, but more on broader cultural issues. Brexit is an example of this. I think Brexit has accelerated that process, but I think Brexit hasn't caused this. I think this is a more long-standing issue, and you certainly do see it in other places. You certainly see it in the US. I'd be interested in Malcolm's views as to whether we're seeing this in Australia as well, but my understanding is that we are. And so we are seeing a divide that perhaps reflects, if you want to predict how someone will vote, then you, rather than just looking at their economic position, also understanding their education, the nature of the place that they live, how ethnically diverse it is, how densely populated it is. There's an urban versus rural split. There's a multi-ethnic, multicultural versus mono-ethnic and monocultural split. And in those circumstances where we see such a realignment, the two big parties that exist become really quite strange coalitions. Both the main parties, my view, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, are struggling to cope with this realignment of politics. But I want to particularly focus on my old party, the Conservative Party, is that because of first past the post, because it is very hard for new entrants, what happens is that one particular part of the Conservative Party, the more culturally right-wing part, becomes dominant because it adds new recruits from those realigned voters. And we often talk about the red wall in British politics, but those voters have moved over to the Conservative Party, not on economic grounds, but on cultural grounds. They are on culturally to the right of the traditional Conservative voters. And the big fear for the Conservative Party is allowing space to its right, allowing Nigel Farage or someone like him to re-emerge. And so the Conservative Party is dragged in a populist nationalist direction because all the pressure is to ensure that it keeps hold of populist and nationalist voters. It keeps hold of its more moderate voters to some extent, but because they tend to be in constituencies with large Conservative majorities already, they don't need to try quite so hard for those voters. And because those voters perhaps have nowhere else particularly to go, in the last general election, those voters were very worried about Jeremy Corbyn, it is that they have very little influence, they have very little leverage on the direction of our politics. And what I worry about at the moment is with first past the post, that the Conservative Party becomes ever more nationalist and populist, trying to retain red wall constituencies, is that that it has essentially unbalanced the Conservative Party. And over its long history, the Conservative Party has always had its ultras, but it's also had its more liberal, more pragmatic, more moderate supporters, who very often made up the leadership and provided the sense of direction towards the Conservative Party. Now, my view is that I think the Conservative Party has set on a trajectory that is not going to change. And it's going to carry on doing just as it's doing today, pursuing policies which I think are fundamentally not in our best interests, more nationalist rather than internationalist, in many respects more extreme. And I think if we had a political system that allowed new entrants, that allowed more competition, that allowed new challenges to the old parties, that in fact that coalition the Conservative Party holds together would break. And I think there would then be a home for those who believe in, as I believe in, a form of pragmatic internationalist, yes, pro-market, pro-business, fiscally conservative politics, but one that is prepared to engage, work with other parties, work with other countries, to see off the extremes. And so the argument I make is, if you like, it's a pragmatic one. I acknowledge the arguments about why our electoral system should be more proportional. And I think those are good arguments. I want to make an additional argument that I think our politics would be better. And if you look where populism, I think, has emerged as being the most, the strongest forces, we've seen it in the UK and we've seen it in the US. And I look particularly at what's happened to the Republican Party, dominated by the Trumpites, no one prepared to take them on because of that realignment, unbalances parties on the centre right, and the voice of the moderate liberal internationalist centre right is lost from our politics. As someone who believes in the moderate liberal internationalist centre right, I think that is a loss to our politics. I think that is a loss to good government. And I think an electoral system that allows those challenges to the incumbents, that gives people a greater range of choice, is one that would help to deliver better government. Yes, it would be fairer, but I think it would also deliver more pragmatic, sensible, reasoned government, something that I think we badly need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm intrigued to know what you think some of your colleagues or ex-colleagues from that part of the party, did you call them, the internationalist, moderate,
yeah,
centre-right colleagues, what they might say when you ask them if they still thought that first past the post delivered a strong and stable government, and in particular, what do you think Theresa May would say?
Well, if I can answer that one, Kleiner, I suspect Theresa May won't have moved her views, and she is a look, in terms of that group, I am perhaps further along than the view that the Conservative Party is heading in a particular direction and won't be diverted from it. But I'm struck, and I don't want to name names and and reveal positions that aren't in the public domain. But I am struck by the conversations I have had with a number of my former colleagues who are coming round to precisely the same view. At the very least, some who were genuinely hostile to proportional representation are now ambivalent. And there are others, and those who are kind of on the record of favouring electoral reform. People like Rory Stewart and Amber Rudd, have stated publicly their views on this. But I certainly know of others who are coming round to it. I suspect Theresa May maybe still some distance away from. I haven't talked to her specifically on this point, but I'd be surprised if she's changed her view. She is a great, also she is a great believer in the constituency link, and a very good dedicated constituency MP. So I'd be surprised if she's moved her position, but many others have.
Well, it's very exciting to have you in the Alliance to Make Votes Matter now, and I'm sure we'll have more of your colleagues joining us not too distant future, and we're going to be at the Conservative Conference this year trying to bring some more of them on board, so hopefully that will help. Thank you very much. I want to introduce the questions section. First of all, I want to do massive thanks to Fair Vote Canada, who are co-organisers on this event and have invited lots of people to attend. So thank you to Anita and all of the team over there, and thank you to everyone from Canada who's joined. I'm going to invite people to ask their questions in batches of 3, so the panelists can pick which ones are relevant to them to respond to. So I'm going to first of all ask questions from, we don't have all of the surnames, so Mike has a question on constituency links, and on people about explaining PR to people who've lived under first past the post, and then Chris Hammond. So Mike, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great, please.
Hi, yeah, I think the popular view is that PR would remove the constituency link. Now, I don't think that is the case, but I think that is the view of the general public. So I think there's a communication issue. What do we do to get across the reality that there's different ways of doing it that will keep that?
Thank you very much, Mike. And then we've got Anne.
Yes, I was trying to explain this to my stepfather yesterday, and he's only ever known first past the post, so he understands that. I was trying to explain that that means that most people might have voted against whoever gets first past the post, but I think there may be a difficulty explaining it to people who've only ever known that system.
Thank you very much. And then Chris Hammond.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for an amazingly interesting webinar with all those fantastic speakers. My question, many people believe we had a vote in 2011 on PR. Could someone please outline the key points we should use to highlight why AV is not PR?
Thank you very much, Chris. And if I may, I'd like to go backwards through the panelists for this one. So David, would you like to kick off?
I think in terms of, I'll pick up this point about the constituency link, and one thing that is worth pointing out that has changed over the last 25 years or so is that, of course, with devolution, that we have had various electoral systems and more proportional electoral systems, whether that be the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament or the London Assembly, where there has been both a constituency role and a more proportional system. So we can point to places where and parts of our system where this has operated. I think there's, I thought Georgina was very interesting about Mexico and that kind of concern about the top-up list and is that a second-class group, or can that be abused and so on. But I think the fact that you can still have your constituency MP, you've still got that person that you can go to for the constituency surgery, someone you can send an email to, that they are there. And then you have got others who will also play a role. And it's one of those ones, you can never get it in, that once you've got somebody who is around, and even the constituency list people will be visible, will be seen at the big events, then I think it becomes straightforward. But yes, I don't underestimate the challenge in terms of explaining what's going on. And of course, AV is a very different system.
Thank you very much, David. Georgina, would you like to come in?
Yeah, and in terms of the constituency link, this is precisely one of the big criticisms in Mexico, is that people effectively say that these PR representatives answer to political parties and not really to electors. And I believe this is one of the big failures of our system in particular. But I believe there are ways to correct it, as I said in my last intervention. That is because we have closed and blocked lists of candidates. But other countries have made it past this. For instance, I can think of Colombia. They also have closed and blocked lists, in the sense that you must sort of, when you vote for a majority post, you're implicitly endorsing the entire party's list on PR. But for instance, what Colombia has done is that it submits several lists in each region, and then you can pick from that list when you're at the ballot box. But there are other systems. For instance, I can think of Brazil, Chile, Peru. They have systems of unblocked lists or semi-open lists where voters can make their choices out of the candidates in the provided lists. There really is no example in Latin America of completely open lists, but that is the way I believe semi-open lists have worked, and that creates a stronger link with constituencies. I mean, you can sort of, the counter argument to that is that, well, that plays against party discipline. But I believe that is the way to address this concern about the links with constituencies.
Thank you, Georgina. And Malcolm, would you like to respond to any of those questions?
On the 2011 referendum, if that's the right word in Britain, I won't bore us with how appalled I am at that exercise, foolish in conception, manipulated by propaganda, etc. But more importantly, it's been used ever since as a reason to do nothing. And this applies also with respect to everyone in Canada who's listening, where referendums have been used time and again as a blocking exercise. I recommend against the referendum as a means of moving forward on these issues, although sometimes the political scenario may benefit from it. But AV is simply not a PR system. I live in one. It's simply not a PR system. What happened in Britain in 2011 was not an attempt to introduce PR. On explaining to people who've only lived under first past the post, with my experienced advocate hat on, you've got to give people a story that's about them to explain why they should think about something and change. And I suspect the two elements most useful to explain to people are that if first past the post makes everyone radically unequal in their level of influence over who forms a membership of the House of Commons, and that it's radically lacking in choice. But you've got to have an explanation that actually speaks to someone about something that where they're in the story in order to persuade them to support change. And on the constituency link, well, if if you voted for the opposition and you didn't get up, the MP isn't really serving you. If they're not representing you, and if they come from a political party you don't support, you're not getting any benefit from this concept of a geographical link. I would suggest that if people want to vote for representatives for reasons to do with local geography, let them. But most people will want to vote for politicians for reasons other than that, such as the political party they support or whatever. You know, a system such as STV will allow people to do that. MMP is argued by its supporters to have the same effect. But the constituency link or bust argument is not strong. In Australia, where you've got STV, people will often go and badger 2 or 3 different members of parliament because they've now got access to a government member for some purposes and an opposition or crossbench member for other purposes. And it provides multiple links that are more usable.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. We are now going to introduce a few more questions. So Charmy or Shami and Jane Cotton Settle and Stephen Gosling, if you could be ready to ask your questions. I'm going to start with Charmy, is that how you say it? Are you there? You might need to unmute yourself if you are.
Yes, I kept unmuting and it didn't work. Yes, I just wondered whether a PR system would change the demographic of representatives. And probably, you know, you said you wanted a question from a woman, so would it let more women, you know, would it make more women become MPs or representatives? I mean, it's not only women that count, it's all sorts of demographics, but does it create a better mix?
Thank you for that. Jane Cotton Settle, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, which particular question did you want me to?
There was one about David Gork and Stephen Kinnock's perspective on first past the poo.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean,
church.
it's interesting. We're used to hearing this phrase, the broad church, and this is a party of the broad church, used by Labour quite often, but now I'm hearing that as an undertone with what David's saying about the Conservatives. They're moving away from the broad church. So is that a good argument for not having first past the post?
Thank you. And then Stephen Gosling, hello.
Hi, Clara. Hope you're well.
Hi.
Yeah, so my question was, looking at the US and the USA in particular, how would PR help us to have popular consensus and avoid populism?
Thank you. Okay, and now I'd suggest whichever speaker wants to respond first, put your hand up and we'll bring you in. Is that Malcolm? Yeah.
I'm happy to go. On representation of women, Australia is doing better than in the past. The Senate now has a majority of women. The House just elected a whole crop of independent women, and there was a deliberate movement that caused that. We're now up to, I think, about 40% female representation in the House and over 50% in the Senate. The STV houses all have higher or better balances, for want of a better expression. But the key is party pre-selection of candidates. If the parties won't pre-select women in winnable places, they won't get up. On the question relating to the US, I don't know how to help the US at the moment. But look, Australia has a vote of about 4 or 5% for what you might call populist right candidates. The moral question is, should they be represented in Parliament by a few MPs or not? And to come back to something David said when he was talking about the concern of the Conservative Party about the escape on their right, at least preferencing the preferential system means that you don't have to be afraid of losing a bit to your right. The votes will possibly flow back to you. Or if the members get elected to your right, they're probably not radically changing the overall balance of who's going to form government. But it's a moral question. Do you suppress the presence of representatives of those points of view in your parliament or not? And until you've thought through an answer to that, you're not going to deal with the problem of dissatisfaction.
Thank you, Malcolm. Georgina, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. You know, about how to get more women elected. You know, I do not, there's actually no evidence that any single system in itself will be more beneficial for women or will help us, you know, ensure that more women will get elected. So any system, whether it's first past the post, whether it's proportional representation, must be accompanied by a set of rules that that will enable other, like, women to get elected, more women to get elected. In the case of Mexico and most of Latin America, that has been the case for quota systems. As I said before, we had our first quota system in Mexico. I believe it was back in 2002 when we required all political parties to submit their candidate lists, both by first past the post and PR, to be at least 30% women. And then, later we had a 40% quota, and it was until 2014 where it was a constitutional mandate for parties to submit their candidate lists both by first past the post and proportional representation made up of 50% men, 50% women. But that's not nearly enough. You have to have other specific rules to ensure that more women get elected, because sexism and violence against women in politics is still alive and well everywhere in the world. I'm not just speaking about Mexico here. And I'm not just talking about violence in a physical form, but violence in terms of preventing women from effectively exercising their political rights. I agree that it has to come from, political parties and the way they select their candidates, but this is also has to be accompanied by specific rules to ensure that women are afforded the same chance to compete and in a level playing field with men.
Thank you, Georgina. I just want to share one of our kind of favourite stats. Whilst obviously no voting system kind of guarantees anything on its own, there aren't any legislatures in the world that have over 40% women that are not proportional democracies. So there's definitely a correlation there. And I'd like to pass to David for any responses that you've got, please.
Thanks. Just in terms of the question about the broad church and the Conservative Party, look, I think what happened, what has traditionally been the case with the Conservative Party is that there was if you like, a broad church on cultural issues, but quite sort of closely aligned on economic issues. And at the last general election, it sort of switched to being a sort of very broad church on economic issues, which is partly why I think there's a lack of coherence in economic policy in the government now, but but a sort of narrower focus on cultural issues. So it was less of a broad church, and in particular on the issue of Brexit and our relationship with the European Union, you basically had to sign up to the Boris Johnson approach, or you were out. And I think that's that was unfortunate. It was not great for me, but I think it was unfortunate for the Conservative Party. And the sort of point on populism is that, look, to some extent, up until relatively recently, the populist vote was dispersed, and you could say, well, the vote on the right, more of it would have gone to the Conservative Party. Not universally went to the Conservative Party, but that kind of vote tended to go to the Conservative Party, but it was outweighed by other factors, and it didn't really influence the Conservative Party that much, I would argue. Now things have changed. The kind of more populist and nationalist approach, in fact, is extraordinarily influential. I won't say it makes up the majority of MPs, but it's a set of the electorate that is crucial to the Conservatives winning majorities, just in the same way that the Republicans in the US need the kind of Trumpite supporters if they are going to win, many of the states there, and that's where I think first past the post leads to problems. And if you can say, look, let's have a populist party, let's have a kind of more moderate, liberal centre-right party, and people will vote for them, and then the populist vote will be more clearly identified, and I think it will be less influential, less powerful than it currently is.
Thank you, David. Okay, I'm going to go for another round of questions. Let's keep them quite quick fire and quick fire responses if we can. I'm going to ask Vicky Seddon and then Sean Shaw, and then Andy Berryman. So would you like to start, Vicky?
Yes, sure. I have a real sense that the mood is changing around PR. And we had a stall in Sheffield in support of Make Votes Matters Action Day on Saturday. And we had a real sense that more and more people, when we said what we need is a fair voting system, they said, oh, you mean PR, don't you? And yes, we'll come and sign Make Votes Matters petition. So does David agree that there is some sense, or has he experienced some sense that the mood is changing?
Thank you. And then Andy, would you like to ask your question?
I think it's the same kind of question, really, isn't it? It's so with 30% of voters in 2019 voting tactically, do we think that politicians are starting to recognise electoral reform as a doorstep issue? It's a phrase that's often used, i.e. as a promise that might affect how people use their vote?
Thank you. Carrying on thematically. So now to Sean Shaw. You may need to unmute yourself. Are you here? I think maybe not. So maybe we just take those two. And again, put your hand up if you'd like to answer the question.
Oh,
there you are.
Yes, I've managed to unmute myself, usually challenged by technology. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems I think is that the public just doesn't understand how PR works. And it is quite complicated. And I don't know how we can inform people and make them aware, particularly as I think so many people are so disillusioned about politics and politicians. I was talking to some people recently and they said they just didn't bother to vote because they didn't think there was anyone worth voting for, basically. I think that's a major issue.
Thank you. Great. So let's go to Malcolm first.
Taking the first and third mood, and I'll just speak about the Australian experience because I'm not so plugged into yours, but I do not think there is a mood for electoral reform in Australia because people believe, rightly or wrongly, that the preferential system is giving them enough choice. We just saw an election where they whacked the major political parties viciously. So there's no mood for change in the system here, but there's clearly a mood for changing who gets elected. The two major parties, the lowest vote ever, people are looking for alternatives all over the place. That's not quite, it's not quite analogous to the mood for change that Vicky mentioned about what was happening in Britain. As to difficulty in explaining how PR works to people, I'm the wrong person to ask because I understand it, but in Australia, because people have the experience of STV, virtually every Australian votes for the Senate. So you get a lot of questions from people going, I don't understand how the preferences will flow, but that's understandable. But at least every Australian has an experience of STV, and that is unique except for Ireland in the world, and it helps.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I think in terms of whether there's a mood change, I mean, I've talked about elements of the centre right, I think, sort of recognising this. My sense is that the public as a whole, I don't know whether generally the wider population is sort of thinking, you know what, we need proportional representation. But what they are thinking is that our politics is failing. They are looking at what is offered and thinking it's not good enough, that the choice isn't good enough. I mean, for goodness sake, at the last general election, we were essentially offered a choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, and the United Kingdom can and should do so much better than that. And so that sort of sense that we have been, we are not comfortable as a nation. Our politics has been very divided. Our politicians are not respected. The quality of and competence of government is not well regarded. And I think putting this into, and Malcolm talked about having a narrative, and I think putting this into a narrative of reform, of modernisation, of a sense that we can do much better as a country, that the current system isn't working, and being able to explain why, as part of that. I don't think this can be the entirety, but as part of what we're about, electoral reform, it is necessary to provide more serious government. That what we currently have is just not good enough, and so try to sort of make the argument in that way. And I think there is a mood for substantial change, that the current system is tired and inadequate and not working, and this should be part of what we become.
Thank you, David. Georgina, would you like to contribute as well?
Yeah, well, I certainly can't speak about the mood in the UK, but I can talk about Mexico's experience. Now, I've mentioned before why PR has become unpopular in recent years here in Mexico. And I can't remember, at least in my lifetime, of a president that has not actively campaigned to get rid of PR, and that sometimes has become popular with a certain sector of voters. But in the end, those proposals never come through because they know that other political parties would never support it in terms of an electoral reform. And the beauty of that is that, well, I believe that's a very good sign of a healthy democracy, in the sense that, you know, a party that is in power at some point in time is not always going to be in power, probably not in the next 3 years. And that is, you know, the sign of a very healthy relationship, democracy, in a sense that in a democracy, the only uncertainty you should have is the uncertainty around the winners and the winning party. And that is a sign of a healthy democracy. And in that sense, you know, when other political parties have a chance to be on top at some point in time, well, I believe that's the main reason why other political parties have not supported getting rid of the PR system at some point. And I believe that is in terms of how do you communicate this to the public, because I'm also a very firm supporter of the PR system in general. And that is probably the importance of the work of organizations like Make Votes Matter and other grassroots organizations, the institutions that organize elections themselves. In the case of Mexico, that has been the case of our National Electoral Institute, is that they have done a very effective job in trying to communicate why our system works like this. For instance, it was very important when in our ballot, when you're voting for your majority representative or the representative in your district, in the back part of the ballot, you have the lists of all the candidates for PR for every single political party. And that was a very, very aggressive campaign our electoral institutions did at the moment, in terms of communicating what our ballot looks like, and what you're voting for is not just one candidate that's in one side of the ballot, but actually a whole list of other candidates in the other side of the ballot. And yeah, that's a good way to start with communication. Certainly events like this and you know, other social media strategies for effectively trying to get a message across citizens on how this works and how this impacts them directly.
Thank you very much, Georgina. We're basically out of time. There were a whole load of other excellent questions, which I wish we could have had asked as well. So apologies for those of you that we didn't get to, but please do continue the conversation. For example, on Facebook, we've got a group where you can continue talking with each other. If you do get involved in Make Votes Matter activism as well, we've got various kind of WhatsApp groups, and we're going to be having some in-person gatherings. So do get to our website and get involved there. We've got a couple of events coming up. The next in this series of Democracy Loves is called Democracy Loves Local Power. That will be on the 19th of July and will feature Paul Sweeney, MSP, Zach Polanski, Assembly Member, and Jackie Weaver. So do come along for that as well. I'm sure if you're not on our mailing list, do go to the Make Votes Matter website, sign up to get involved, and you'll get the information about that. And it would be great to see some of you there. And thank you so much to all of the speakers for your excellent contributions. Really appreciate, we had a really interesting conversation tonight, and hearing really different perspectives, so that's fantastic. Thanks to all of you, the attendees, for attending. It wouldn't be anything without you. And absolutely massive thanks to the team for organising this, particularly Alex Toll, who has done the bulk of the legwork around it. So thanks all, and have a good evening. I think we're going to finish bang on time, and I hope you all have a lovely evening, and hopefully see you at the next one.